Cofman Wittes, who is a senior fellow at the Center of Middle East Policy at Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Before that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs at the US State Department for the majority of President Obama's first term under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So it's a real delight to have you with us today, Tamara. If you'd like to make some opening comments, and then, as I said, we'll open it up to questions afterwards. But thank you.
Great, Richard. Thank you. Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's an eventful time in Washington, and it's an eventful time in the region. And although typically during the period of a transition in presidential administrations, especially when there's a change in party, we tend to see regional actors kind of go into wait and see mode. I don't think that's what's going on in the region right now. So let me start with a few comments about the pieces that are still moving in the Middle East as we speak, and then talk a little bit about what we may see once President-elect Biden is sworn in on January 20th. So Secretary of State Pompeo is just finishing a swing through the region. He stopped in Israel. As you all know, he's spent time in the Gulf. And the sort of stated focus of the trip is to coordinate new sanctions and additional constraints on Iran as part of the maximum pressure policy that has been the Trump administration's approach to Iran. Now, maximum pressure has had significant impact on the Iranian economy. And it has not as yet generated any significant change in Iran's foreign policy stance or its willingness to engage in negotiations with the international community, either over its nuclear program or its other activities around the region that are disturbing to neighboring states and destabilizing to regional security. The sad fact is that those components of Iranian behavior that are driven by the Revolutionary Guard are relatively inexpensive, number one, unlike a nuclear program, which can be quite expensive. And number two, the IRGC benefits under sanctions, and it benefits when there are not sanctions. When sanctions are in place, the IRGC makes a lot of money smuggling around the region and in and out of Iran. And of course, it has other ways of financing and laundering its funds all around the world. This is a huge intelligence project that the United States and other countries are engaged in, is tracking down IRGC financing and trying to interdict it. But they have plenty of funds for what it is that they want to do. And when the Iranian economy is more open, the IRGC actually dominates certain sectors of the economy right now. And so in the formal economy, they also make money. So the plain fact is that maximum pressure has a huge impact on the domestic environment in Iran, but it doesn't have that much direct impact on the IRGC's malign activities in Lebanon, in Syria, in the Gulf, and elsewhere. So, you know, I think the Trump administration's approach kind of ratcheted up the pressure, but it didn't really offer either a clear set of priorities from the United States that the Iranian government might be able to respond to if it were inclined to, nor did it offer any kind of diplomatic off-ramp for the tensions that were created. And so while I think America's regional partners have been very supportive of maximum pressure and they like the constraints that have been placed on the Iranian government and the Iranian economy, they have been worried, particularly over the last year, about escalation in this US-Iran confrontation that has no endpoint and no exit ramp. So especially after January, when the United States carried out a targeted strike on Qasem Soleimani, and there was a sudden, sharp increase in military tensions in the Gulf. I think you saw several Gulf Arab states trying to signal independently to Tehran that they didn't want an all-out confrontation. So there's been a lot of need for coordination, and Pompeo now is working to sustain that and also to do what he can to maximize the steps the United States has taken that a future administration will have to decide what to do with. And I don't see any reason to expect that a Biden administration will, immediately seek to provide sanctions relief to the Iranians. In fact, I think we've already seen public statements from the Biden team that that's not their intention. Certainly, but they do have an intention to explore Iran's willingness to return to compliance with the JCPOA. And they have said that if Iran is willing to return to compliance, and I think that's a big if, that they would be willing to return to the JCPOA as well. I don't think that there's any near-term prospect for that. I think the Iranians are going to take their time. They're going to try and maximize the price that they can get for returning to the negotiating table. And they have presidential elections coming up in May. Not that that process is an open, competitive process, but elections in Iran are often a delicate moment for the regime, and often a moment in which Iranian opposition expresses dissent, and often a moment in which there are popular protests. And so I think they're going to want to manage their situation quite carefully, at least through May. On the American side, we all know that the problem posed by Iran to regional and international security is not just a US problem, and the negotiation isn't just going to be a US-Iran negotiation. And so the priority for the Biden administration is to repair its relationships with key alliance partners in NATO, in East Asia, with other key regional security partners, including in the Middle East, so that any diplomatic engagement with Iran can start with all of us on the same page and can give us as strong a hand as possible. So I don't think there's any rush to return to the table on the American side either. So that's on Iran in terms of where we are now and where we might go. Let me talk a little bit about other major issues in the region. Probably the most dramatic development in the last several months in terms of regional security is the formalization of the rapprochement between Israel and several Arab states. UAE and Bahrain signing formal agreements, Sudan's transitional government indicating that down the road it might be willing to normalize relations. And then, of course, we saw the dramatic news in Israel this morning reporting something the Saudis deny, by the way, that Netanyahu visited Saudi Arabia for a private meeting with Pompeo and the Saudi Crown Prince yesterday. I'm happy to address that more in the Q&A, those reports and what they may or may not mean. Let me just start broadly with where that issue of Israel-Gulf rapprochement fits into the transition that's now underway. The first thing is that there's a bunch of stuff in process, and the transition timeline is not especially convenient for Israel or for the Gulf partners. The UAE had a shopping list that it brought to the Trump administration. They asked for a bunch of sophisticated weaponry in large quantity as a sort of side payment for opening to Israel. And the Trump administration, this is in August, September, when they were in the heat of the re-election campaign and they really wanted the diplomatic win, basically, shrugged and said, sure, whatever you want. So the F-35s, which the Obama administration had made an official commitment to Israel that they would be the only country in the region to get F-35s, the Trump administration has now reversed that commitment and agreed to sell the Emiratis several dozen F-35s, as well as a significant quantity of very sophisticated drones. These are Reaper drones that can be used both for surveillance and for offensive purposes. And so, there are a few things going on here. One is that the Trump administration has notified this weapons sale to Congress, but there are a lot of concerns in Congress about the scope of what is being offered. Not only because of concerns about Israel's qualitative military edge, but also concerns for American national security. The Emiratis, among other things, have relationships with the Chinese military. They've bought some military equipment from the Chinese, and so they have Chinese trainers and advisors on the ground. The US has to be sure it can protect its F-35, this unique capability that marries a fighter jet with sophisticated intelligence, protect that from Chinese espionage. And given that the Emiratis have intervened in several civil wars around the region over the last decade or so, we also have to have concern about the capabilities that we're giving the Emiratis, and we have to have assurances from the Emiratis that these weapons are only going to be used in ways that are congruent with American interests, not just Emirati interests. So there is a resolution that's been introduced in Congress to disapprove of this arms sale. I don't think it will succeed, but I do think that it represents real concerns expressed by the way, by both Democrats and Republicans. So that arms sale is still in play. Israel, of course, had to then engage in a very swift negotiation with the United States about what we call a compensation package, what Israel would get from the United States to help preserve its qualitative military edge. My understanding from news reporting is that the informal negotiation has been concluded, but the Trump administration has not yet put that in front of Congress or otherwise notified its formal intention to provide the requested equipment to Israel. So I think both the Israelis and the Emiratis have stuff at stake in Washington that the Trump administration is trying to rush through, on which there are differences between the administration and Congress, and on which there are questions about how the Biden administration, when it comes in, might seek to approach the issue. And so that too is something that's very much live over these next couple of months. Let me conclude with just a couple of minutes on President-elect Biden's what he's going to face coming into office on January 20th in terms of the Middle East and, what I think are likely to be the big issues ahead besides the two that I've already discussed. Let's begin with the fact that President-elect Biden is someone with deep experience in foreign affairs. It has been his focus through most of his long career in public life. He is also someone, through his work in Congress and in the Obama administration, has developed deep relationships all around the world. And like many who come out of the Senate, is a deep believer in the importance of relationships. And throughout the campaign, one of their foreign policy themes has been the importance of good relationships, friendships, alliances, and partnerships to American strength abroad, to American national security, and their intent to strengthen and repair those relationships. So I think that is going to be a key theme for Biden. He has everything he needs to hit the ground running in this region. But the ground in the region has shifted a lot since he was last in office, since he was President Obama's vice president. The upheavals in the Middle East over the last 4 years are extraordinary. We have this intense power competition going on across the region, not only between Iran and the Arab states, but also between some Arab states and Turkey. We've seen Russia claim a larger role in Syria. We've seen China beef up its naval presence in the Gulf. And so all of these have changed the equation for the United States in this region. And we've also seen new developments in the politics of the region itself. The nascent democratic transition in Sudan, which I think, if it can be secured, will be an incredibly positive development for security on the Horn of Africa, for security in that strategic critical space between the Horn and the Arabian Peninsula. And I think it will be good for regional security as a whole. And of course, we have the Abraham Accords. So, what I'm hearing from regional partners of the United States is that they are looking forward to more consistency, more transparency, more reliability in American communications and American policy. The Trump administration, in sort of the short-term transactional sense, was very beneficial to a number of regional governments, but it wasn't seen as reliable. It was seen as capricious, and it took steps at several points without any consultation with regional partners. Probably the most egregious examples being Trump's decision to withdraw troops from Syria and the decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani and set off that tension in January. So I do think there's a little bit of relief amongst regional partners, but there are also a bunch of outstanding issues. And I think in addition to the US-Israel relationship, which we can talk about in the Q&A, I would point to the US-Saudi relationship and the US-Egyptian relationship as two that are now layered with problems and challenges. In both cases, I think the fundamentals, the logic of those relationships has changed in recent years. And so there's a real need for honest conversation between those two capitals and Washington about what these partnerships are for, where they agree, where they disagree, how to resolve the grievances that have emerged between them, and how tight of a partnership they can really expect going forward. And I think the answers to those questions will structure a lot of what the United States is or isn't able to do in this region in the years to come. So I've just put a lot on the table. Why don't I stop there and look forward to questions and discussions with you.
Thank you so much for those really excellent opening remarks and your overview of the region. So for those that joined us a couple minutes after the introduction, we are moving into the Q&A session now, and we will stop recording this just in a moment after I use my prerogative to ask my first question. And if you would like to ask a question, you can utilize the chat function or raise your hand as one does in Zoom, and I will give you permission to ask our esteemed panelists today what you would like. So perhaps we can just start with something you mentioned in your remarks, which is the big news that we all woke up to this morning, with Prime Minister Netanyahu flying to Saudi Arabia, essentially leaking that he met with Pompeo and the Crown Prince. And there's an argument that this was some kind of signal or even a warning to an incoming Biden administration, the fact that this news was made public. So can you perhaps flesh out for us a little bit how you view this in terms of the perspective of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the impact that will have on the region and even in fact the relationship between Washington and Saudi Arabia?
Okay, so I mean, let's start by just acknowledging that the drama of an Israeli prime minister holding formal talks with the incoming Saudi leader, the Crown Prince, on Saudi soil. It's very dramatic. It's very symbolic. If, in fact, the meeting took place, which the Saudis have issued strong denials. That doesn't mean it didn't take place, but I think it's notable that they're not willing to own it. The drama is significant. It's meaningful, and if, in fact, there were a breakthrough, a formalization, or a reveal of what has been a covert line of communication that's existed for a number of years between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that would be an unalloyed good thing, right? It's good for regional security. It's good for what it says about the willingness of America's regional partners to cooperate more overtly in confronting shared threats and perhaps in exploring shared opportunities. So that's great. And I don't think there's any question, let's be clear, that a Biden administration would welcome that warmly and with open arms. So I'm not sure what the theory would be by which this would be seen as some kind of warning to a Biden administration. I think it's an unalloyed positive for everyone in Washington. Here's what it's not, though, and I do think it's important to understand this. There are two components here. One is, when the Abraham Accords were revealed and signed, there was a lot of discussion about whether this was just a fundamental game changer in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the opening of Gulf states to Israel demanded that we rethink our approach to Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. And while it's true that the Arab states' willingness to open to Israel without an Israeli-Palestinian agreement is a reversal of long-held Arab government policies, and it is an overturning of the Arab Peace Initiative, it is a significant development, but I am not one of those who sees in the immediate sense anyway, ways in which that opening is going to have a positive impact on the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. At the end of the day, the challenges between Israelis and Palestinians are on the ground between the two societies, between two leaders who don't trust one another and aren't interested in engaging with one another. And the conflict between them is a conflict that will have to be resolved between them. There really isn't a substitute for that. What I do think the Abraham Accords can provide is a kind of atmosphere, an environment of support for Israeli-Palestinian rapprochement. And to the extent that the Gulf states are open not only to diplomatic relations, but at the societal level, at the people-to-people level, it is to me a great reminder of something that Israelis haven't felt in a long time, which is kind of a breather, right? That refreshing notion that that our neighbors in the region are willing to accept us and live alongside us and are interested in learning about us, and we're interested in learning about them. You know, it feels more like the Israel-Jordan agreement did when it was first signed in 1994. And so to the extent that that can shift the sense of enclosure or siege that many Israelis feel, I think that's a good thing too, unquestioning. There is also some suggestion that the openings between Israel and the Gulf are primarily the Gulf states' way of talking to Washington. And I think there is some truth to that. As I said, these contacts with Israel have been going on for a long time. So why formalize them now, right? And to formalize them now is to create something that everyone in Washington, Democrats and Republicans, even in the middle of an election campaign, can agree is a good thing. And to help those governments look like positive forces in the region to both Democrats and Republicans. Yeah, that's politically wise. And so if that's what's going on with the Saudis too, you know, yeah, I think there will be some positive impact in Washington. But in the case of the US-Saudi relationship, there are a bunch of very specific, very significant concerns in Washington about Saudi policy and about the Saudi approach to the region and to the United States. We, in the last 5 years, have seen the Saudis invade their neighbor. We've seen them plant spies in a major American company. We have seen them send Saudi official employees to the United States to try and intimidate or maybe even kidnap Saudi dissidents who are living here. And of course, we've seen the horrific abuse of diplomatic facilities and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And we've also, by the way, seen the Saudis use diplomatic facilities here in the United States to help Saudi citizens who are living here escape the US court system when they're accused of ordinary crimes. So these are US Saudi issues. And I don't think a Saudi-Israeli opening, as great as it would be, really cleans the slate there. I think that is something that the US and Saudi are going to have to do bilaterally, regardless of this opening. That was a long answer to a great question, Roni.
Thank you.